even weaker. Now, yesterday evening we had the first of what I believe will be 4 one-hour interviews by the filmmaker Oliver Stone with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, in the Kremlin and similar places. And I found this disappointing from a number of points of view. Let it be said at the beginning that this is, on the whole, a softball interview. It's not probing, but given that, let's just see if there's anything notable. This was a little bit the history of how Putin came to be where he is. And of course, he was, as he described it, right, selected by Boris Yeltsin, right, Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, the president of Russia during the 1990s, from 92 until the until December 31st, 1999, and that Yeltsin chose Putin to be prime minister. Putin says he was uncertain what was going to happen to him, and then eventually he became designated as the successor, right, as the Dauphin. The question then is, the issues of those years are the origin of the Russian oligarchy. And it would have been very interesting to hear Putin's take on the origin of the oligarchs. Right? So Putin is somebody who comes from St. Petersburg, right? Leningrad at the beginning of this time. St. Petersburg is older name, and now we're back to the older name. So Putin said, I really didn't have a big political base in Moscow. I had my people in St. Petersburg, so I didn't know what was going to happen. So we got a couple of things that are mentioned, right? And Oliver Stone essentially says to him, isn't it true that you stopped privatization? Now, privatization meant you had this immense state property of the Soviet Union, right, which had been the fruits of a process of primitive accumulation imposed by Stalin, right, who had tens of thousands of forced laborers building infrastructure. And some of this stuff got privatized, right? I'm thinking of the Volga-Don Canal, right, between the Volga and the Don. Interesting juxtaposition of words, or, all these other things, right? The oil, the minerals, the entire Soviet economy. This was essentially delivered into the hands of private individuals who in many cases were oligarchs. In other words, they were party apparatchiki, right? Apparatchik is the less complimentary term. The word that Putin uses in this interview, to the extent you can hear the Russian, is chinovnik. Chinovnik. That's a somewhat more respectful term for a government official or bureaucrat. So Putin says it's not true that I stopped privatization. I just made privatization more fair. And then the question was, I think this is more brought up by Putin, frankly, than by Oliver Stone. Couldn't there have been a clawback? In other words, once you came into power and you somehow, if not, you didn't stop privatization, but you made it more equitable, could there not have been a moment of clawback where some of the state property could have been resumed by the state? In other words, the state could have taken over again, but there was no clawback. In other words, Putin went through this thing, zakon, a law is a law, and once they had it, they were going to keep it, and there was nothing much that you could do. And then, of course, we have this wonderful moment where Oliver Stone reads Putin a list of his own economic achievements, which are considerable. There is some oblique mention in the background of Chechen wars, right? The first Chechen war in the 90s, and then the second Chechen war starting at the end of the 90s and reaching well into the current century. And Oliver Stone acts as if these were sort of, acts of God. They were just there, right? They were just part of the territory. And of course, it really was Putin and his administration that decided to pursue these wars in the way that they did. We also have Oliver Stone saying Ronald Reagan did a good job when it came to public communication. Now, I'm sorry, some of this stuff I can't follow. I can't. I'm not going to try to refute it, but some of this stuff is just not accurate. So when it comes to Afghanistan, and Chechnya, and in Afghanistan also, Putin puts forward this thesis, which I think has some merit. He says Al Qaeda was not a creation of us. Al Qaeda is a creation of the United States during the Afghan war. In other words, the war of Afghani guerrillas against the Soviet forces that were occupying parts of the country. So he says, we have always reproached the U.S. for being so much in cooperation with terrorists. They mention Bill Casey, right? William Casey, Reagan's CIA boss, who said that one of his goals was regime change in the USSR, right, back from Yeltsin and Putin to something else. There's a bunch of stuff about NATO expansion. It starts off with Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic under Clinton, then becomes Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia under Bush. Bush had even considered Albania and Croatia, and I guess that some of that at least is done. Putin has a low opinion of Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a talker, not a doer, and this is actually interesting. He says, this is now Oliver Stone asking, wasn't there a commitment not to expand NATO into Eastern Europe? And wasn't that violated? And Putin says, yes, there was an understanding, but it was only verbal. It was not written down. And Gorbachev thought that the verbal assurances were enough. And of course, they were not enough. But the result of that is that there was no such assurance. I also wonder with Putin, does it ever occur to him to wonder why all these countries were so eager to join NATO? In other words, these countries, many of which had been occupied by the Soviets or controlled by the Soviets as satellites and so forth, does it ever occur to him that this anti-Soviet, anti-Russian backlash may have reasons and that those might be addressed? And certainly Oliver Stone is not going to ask any of that stuff. We have the famous appearance by Putin at the Munich Security Conference, right, the Wehrkunde, in the February of 2007, which is his big attack on the theory of the unipolar world run by the U.S. No, we won't accept that, and so forth. So these are interesting samples, but I have to say I would have been happy to hear a lot more about the origins of the oligarchs, right? And the relations of Putin to the oligarchs now, because I think this is the really interesting topic. The regime is a kind of compromise between Putin and his team of chinovniki, right, of government bureaucrats, apparatchiki. That's the government, and they're the government, and they keep the upper hand, right, because they have the security services, FSB, KGB, GRU. And then the oligarchs get a lot of leeway to run the economy, and this is it's an uneasy alliance. And of course, each side tends to resemble the other side more and more. And the key moment of stress in this is Khodorkovsky, the head of Rosneft, right, the head of the biggest oil company, I think, in the world, who apparently thought that he should be president and that he would try to do that more or less by any means. And that's when he was sent to Siberia for a good 10 years. And this is the one point where things could have been deprivatized, right? Deprivatized, but were not. They were transferred more or less to other private companies, but private companies under the control of the right people politically. So, that's a very interesting thing, right? Because this is what you don't hear about, right? In other words, what's the internal arrangement? How do things actually work? There's very little about that. I would also want to ask Putin, why did the Soviet Union